Hi, Sociology of the Family students. This is your professor again, Dr. Monica Snowden, and I want to take a few minutes here to share with you some pointers on how I expect you to use these PowerPoints and provide a little bit of explanation on a few slides that are shared for this week. I will be posting a PowerPoint for every chapter in the textbook. So on the second slide, I provide a checklist and it says due dates and times in Canvas. I did not post those, and I probably honestly won't post those because you can see that in the Canvas course easily enough. But what I do put on here is just, again, the checklist for the week. So for week two, you're going to be completing the article review for Querying Family Research. That's due on Sunday night, 11:59 p.m. You're also completing quiz 1. And then the discussion. And then what I will always include on there is if there is any additional audio or video that is included, approximately the time it will take you to review that. So I do have, like I said, a checklist on the second slide. It can be just a nice place to go and see, at the beginning of the week, sort of, if it's not all clear to you from what's in Canvas what's coming at you. So the slides do complement the book. I do not provide all definitions that are in the book, but I do see them as an outline for how to cover the chapter. And again, not everything is on the slides, but it does give you, it is sort of, I would say, an organizational tool. I also see the PowerPoints as a way to help you review the chapters, material you need to know, as you prepare for quizzes and exams. I will sometimes include some additional content, and if I believe that it needs further explanation than what is shared in the PowerPoint, I will try to provide that either by doing a video as I am here, or providing some audio that I can link on the exam. Doing these videos has taken me a little bit to get back into it this semester. There's a reason why I'm not a news broadcaster. And it's not something that I'm maybe probably super great at. But I did want to point out, for example, with this slide, that the first chapter does not really address kinship, but kinship is an important concept because kinship every society culture has what we call kinship rules. Those rules are formal or informal, and they establish the obligations, the expectations for care and commitment between people who are considered kin. And then authority establishes the formal and informal rules for who has authority to enforce them. And authority is legitimate power to be able to say, no, you can't marry this person, or to encourage you to have children, whatever it may be. But, so what are the kinship rules? They are not the same everywhere. Oftentimes kinship rules are based and rooted in biology and biological, connections to family members are important in one form or another in different societies and cultures, historically and around the world today. Although we'll look at some variation and how this operates as we go forward in the class. It can also be symbolic as well. So, and well, symbolic is the best word. So there may be some expectations of formal of commitment and care if one may not have biological ties, but has social ties to a group. And here I'm talking outside of like legal marriage, for example. So what I'm getting at is, one thing we'll learn is that there's a lot of variation of Native American populations, societies. There's a lot of variation that existed in these cultures and society prior to settler colonialism. And we also, and what we see is, a wide variety of kinship rules in these societies. When the European colonialists began to, establish control and attempted to eradicate the Native American people and their societies, one of the things they did is they imposed kinship rules onto them. And one of those rules was to be enrolled in the tribe is to be able to show a certain percentage of blood quantum. Different tribes now today still may require a certain level of blood quantum to ratio of native blood associated with that tribe to be an enrolled member. Some, however, do allow for people to enroll if they can demonstrate and show that they have a social relationship to that tribe, and that oftentimes may actually involve legal marriage, but it can include growing up within that community and within that culture, even if they do not meet the blood quantum requirement. So that's a little bit of maybe more explanation there than we need for today, but we will be looking at the variation and how kinship has been established in societies over time. Historically, with chapter 2, it is particularly relevant again with Native populations in the United States, but it's also important when we think about how these rules are created and enforced for communities, all different race and ethnic communities historically and to today. So let me continue to go forward. This slide, this is just, you can look at it as an organizational slide. You need to know the definition of personal family and legal family. That's in the textbook. You can easily read that. For this slide, the definition of the institutional arena is in the book. I believe also for this one, if you look at the notes associated with this slide, it is there. One of the reasons I elaborated a little bit here is to point out that the 5 basic social institutions are these listed right here, meaning that sociologists contend, as do anthropologists, is that they are found in some form in all human societies historically and to this day, because they meet an enduring human need. How they're organized and structured, and how tightly they're interconnected with one another has changed over time for societies, and there is a lot of variation today in how they're structured. So institutions are structures, a social structure is a recurrent pattern of behavior, and within that recurrent pattern behavior, we hold positions called statuses, and we play roles in that status. There's expectations for us and how we ought to fulfill that, the obligations of that status. So we can also sometimes we refer to social structures as organizations, organizational units. Marriage tends to be pretty universally found, although we will look at one of what is considered one of the last remaining matriarchies in the world, and they do not have formal marriage. So we'll look at that. So it's a good example though, because what we argue is that you can't, a human society cannot exist, really, survive or thrive and survive in the absence of one of these institutions. But the way in which they're organized can, and they do change over time. And again, how tightly they're interconnected with one another also changes. So institutional interdependence, what happens in one institution affects what happens in another institution. And the 2 other institutions the book particularly emphasizes is that of government and that of the marketplace. So government is where we set the rules for society. That's political, the political institution, and within the government of within our government, there's many different organizations, and levels by which those rules are created and enforced: the local level, state level, federal, and sometimes we're also like to abide by international. And then the economic, which is the marketplace. And that is the institution where we produce for our survival needs and anything beyond that. So this complements what's in the textbook. It looks at the types of interaction that takes place within each of these institutions, the organizational units that are, important. They're not the only organizational units important in these institutions. And then individual roles that we hold. And of course, there's many more than what is listed there. Each chapter includes a story behind the numbers. Please pay attention to that. You may be tested and or quizzed on what is shared in the story behind the numbers. And so that was just sort of why I had that there, was to draw your attention to that. But here again, it's intended to get you to think about how what is done in one institution or the policies, say, in the marketplace affects families. And so in your discussion posts, which were everybody was really impressed with the post that you all made for the first discussion. And one of the issues that arose was, does the workplace treat families with children and families without children in the same way or fairly? One of the things I will challenge just to think about as the semester goes along, and we have a whole chapter on work and family, is to have equity in the workplace. Must that mean that all workers are treated the same? Or are there times or reasons for having policies that may differ for some, given their identities and statuses, like, and in this case, the status of being a parent. So think about it also like this. We also hold statuses within social hierarchies. By social hierarchies, I mean the social class hierarchy of our society. We have social class inequality, that's chapter 4. The race and ethnic hierarchy in our society. We have racial inequity. And that is chapter 3, gender, chapter 5, right? And, and those positions that we hold in each one of those hierarchies, we have a social class position, a race or ethnic identity, an ethnic identity, a gender identity, etc. They also intersect and influence how we experience and are able or not to obtain positions in institutions within society, and how we're expected to play our roles within them. All right, those identities influence that. We'll look at how, but the reason I went off on that is because think about this. For a long time, not a lot of women were in the paid labor market in the United States. There's always some women who were working in the paid labor market and in the formal labor market, like outside of people's homes. But they were pretty small in number up until, really the latter 60s and then 70s and then 80s. It really begins to explode. Lots of women we begin to see in the paid labor force. And what we discover is that these buildings, these structures, of workplaces were not built for female employees. They oftentimes didn't have female bathrooms. And if they did, there were fewer than male bathrooms that were available, or not very conveniently located. And so one thing to achieve gender equity for women in the workplace is that many institutions had to, or workplaces, or these had to do some updating, right, of their infrastructure. They added bathroom space, and because of the cultural norms, and because of the cultural norms associated with being female bodied, women need more space, right? They don't use urinals. They are expected, women expect to have a private stall with a door. They menstruate, etc. So they have different needs. So to be there, what it meant then is you had to create inequity to achieve equity. All right. And you had to have more bathroom spaces available for women if you're going to achieve gender equity. So that's just something to think about. Well, as we go forward, we'll talk about it or discuss it maybe more in upcoming chapters. Noted here is a difference between the census definition and the legal definition of marriage. Of course, your book talks about this in some detail, so I think you can cover that just fine. And that's just a picture of what that's of one of the census questions on family. What is included in the next few slides is some historical definitions. The census is a governmental organization, so they do collect data to help the government with planning policies, to have a sense of who is within our society, and all this can be used to help establish rules and also make sure rights are granted in a way that we want them to be, like voting. But if you just look at these definitions, what is interesting is to think about, and you can think this could potentially be a discussion question for chapter 2, I'm not sure yet, but is to think about, if you look at them, what is going on in society that would cause the government to craft definitions like this? Well, clearly with the 1841, slavery was still legal in the United States. So they had to have a definition of a family that accounted for the fact that some families actually owned other human beings. But there was concerns, with states, the power of southern states, etc., that those enslaved people weren't even counted as full persons. But the reason, if you think about, then how do our government definitions, one, reflect our social lives, but also our economic lives, what's going on in our society, in the economy of our society. So this is a time period in American history where, again, you had enslaved people, you had a economic system that forcefully exploited the labor of human beings, and that also then created a lot of economic and social class inequality that we still contend with to this day for different race and ethnic groups. And particularly economic disadvantage that Black folks have inherited. So anyways, 1860, 70, you can think about, why would you count a household, 200 individuals living together in one household? So think about this with chapter 2, looks at the history of family, and again, how American society was developing and why that would make sense. This looks at how family patterns become institutionalized. And what I just wanted to emphasize here was, that cohabitation, serial monogamy suggests that you're not married to the same person, or you even having an intimate relationship within marriage, right? But that, there is compliance here with monogamy, that's a norm. But that there's also, it's not the same person over one's life course or adult life, sexual life. So these things have been considered deviant, right? At one time, some people would still consider them deviant, but they are today what we would say have become institutionalized. In other words, they're accepted forms of family living and of how we structure our intimate lives. So living alone is a pretty new thing. We have substantial numbers of households that are single households. And many argue that, or show, not just argue, that this is a distinctly Western phenomenon, that it takes quite a bit of economic privilege and power for a country to have lots of people who are, or a significant portion of people who are living alone, right? So, and again, child socialization through daycare, we take that for granted today for the most part as being pretty, expected for lots of kids. But when I first started teaching sociology, this was questioned, and it was still seen as potentially suspect or deviant. So, there was a lot of research that looked at, that looked at, is it harmful to children to spend a significant amount of their time growing up in daycare? And a lot of that research ended up showing for the, that no, there is some, some caveats there, but and then of course, the fact that most parents at some point in their life as a parent need this. So given the way our economy is structured, etc. So it's become institutionalized. The reason I wanted to say a couple things about this slide, and this is says, thinking about family as culture. This is sort of symbolic family. How can different family forms be a symbol? So most of us today do not live in a nuclear family where you live with your family, whereas the parents and their children not living with extended family members. Most of us do not live in a nuclear family where one person is the breadwinner, one person is a homemaker, right? In fact, this model was a fairly, in terms of lots of people doing this, was fairly short-lived in American society. It became a model that became particularly favored during the emergence and then the establishment of industrial capitalism. This is talked about in this chapter through the discussion of structural functionalism with the consensus perspective and conflict theory. So, and we'll revisit it in many chapters throughout the book. But this, even though most of us don't live in this model where one person, you have a married heterosexual couple with children, and the man's going out to work and the woman's staying at home caring for children, the vast majority of Americans don't live this way. It's still the gold standard, right? Is what I was trying to get at. It's still like this, it symbolically seems to still hold a lot of cultural weight, so that people who adhere to that cultural standard, even though most of us don't, if you do, you're almost assumed, to be the best family, right? Even though it could be a family that is actually very toxic. The reason it says middle class, white, cisgender, heterosexual citizens is that, to not only achieve it, but to maintain it, having a standing in the middle class has always been very important. And so this is one thing the labor movement really fought for in the 20th century, was a family wage. This is also discussed in the first chapter. So this is what we want. We need to pay men a family wage, one that they can actually support a family on. We need to give families access to homes that they can actually afford, right? All kinds of policies were established by the state, but they were established really to favor white families at the disadvantage of Black and brown families. So first homeowner loans, which allowed families, in the 20th century to be able to buy their first home, and the government underwrote, the majority of the cost of that. So you would have the privilege of paying off over a period of time. Those loans weren't even made available to Black and brown families. 98% of those loans went to white families. So Black and brown families for a long time, while some maybe did achieve this sort of nuclear family, the breadwinner homemaker model, fewer in number. And many, and this will be chapter 2 and chapter 3, really probably the majority for at least a long time, had to rely on, to some degree, the work of women, the paid work of women, because of discrimination that men faced in the labor force, because of high mortality rates, incarceration, all kinds of things, poverty. So there's been a middle class definitely element to it, as well as race. Certainly, the extension to be able to form a nuclear family legally, right, is favored heterosexuals and cisgender folks, and people who have citizenship status. These are some things, again, that will be addressed in chapter 2 and 3. But also, so to think about, white families are oftentimes just assumed to hail sometimes from these families. That might be a little bit less true today, but we can also use family and family structures as a way to try to stigmatize families. So, and we also use language that can be very stigmatizing to different families, calling some families dysfunctional, or whether or not your family, you live in an intact family. What does that mean? A real family, which usually refers to some type of biological connection. So we'll be looking at how different family structures and then the roles and how people, what statuses they hold within them, in terms of their gendered bodies, as well as the race and ethnicity. How does that influence, how that family is treated? Is it treated as a conforming family, as a good family, or as a potentially deviant family? So we'll look at this quite a bit throughout the semester. Theory, I'm not going to go through each of these theory slides. I have a lot of detail here, but what I want you to think about, if you were asked a question on your exam, because on the exam you will have at least one, if not two, I haven't committed to the exam structure quite yet, but you'll have at least one, if not two, essay questions on there. And you may be asked to choose an issue, or I may just pick an issue in which you would need to analyze it, looking at it from either a consensus perspective or a conflict perspective. There's different theories that fall underneath each of these. So like if I said, you use consensus, or compare and contrast a family issue using the consensus perspective, or the conflict perspective, you may choose a specific theory that would come under it, such as structural functionalism, as discussed in your book, or exchange theory. Or you might use a feminist theory. You might use, the traditional conflict theory would be a Marxist theory, right, which is shared in this chapter. Critical race or queer, and you're reading about queer theory actually a little bit with this first article. So if you want to, that might be something you can do, or you could attach, or you could maybe address it a little bit more broadly, like this is how consensus theorists might look at it, and this is how conflict theorists might look at it. But the starting point is always looking at what are the key assumptions about how society works. So that's where you start. That's where you have to begin to think about the problem at hand and how you look at that family issue from that perspective. Then you begin to look at the structures that they identify within family that they believe are important, and why they believe they're important. The role family plays within society, and then key concepts. So key concepts, for example, often identified with the consensus perspective is the gender division of labor. And sorry, I'm looking at my dog, Archie. Archie, what are you doing? And concepts such as, men are expected in a gender division of labor to fulfill instrumental roles. These are roles that you hold, these are positions you hold outside of society. And the expectation is that in those positions, did I say outside of society, outside of family, like in workplaces and government, and whatever, institution or structure outside of family, the idea is that a man is creating things and making things, doing things autonomously, making decisions, has potential authority, right? An instrumental role. They're transforming society in some ways. Women need to fulfill roles within the family, within the private sphere, because they are more suited to them, because of their biology, their sex, that's their constitution. They are suited for expressive roles, roles where emotion is important and care is important. So you again, read that in your book. Conflict theorists look at inequality, and in particular look at how, let me just go back here. One of the things that's noted in your book is that conflict theorists see inequality as a source of social change. That is true, but they don't assume that inequality is natural or that it has to be, and certainly the extent of it. So, they're not arguing for utopias, but conflict theorists generally point out that inequality causes harm to those who definitely are on the short end of the stick. They're getting less from society. That's in terms of income or wealth, power, the influence they have over their own lives, let alone over others, status, respect, prestige. They're getting less. How much less varies over time between societies. But they're getting less. That's why they're a minority group. Sometimes we use words like disadvantaged or marginalized. Definitely harms them, but it also can create harms to majority groups, to those who have privilege, even though they receive privileges. So it's not saying that those privileges don't exist. It's saying that even the privilege may have a stake in reducing, at the very least, the amount of inequality around a status, if not attempting to, eradicating it. So this could be a really long lecture, a really long discussion. I can really go off here, but we're looking at differentials between groups with more or less power, greater access, less access to societal resources. And social class inequality is what Marx looked at. Again, read the chapter section on this for more explanation. But one of the things that is pointed out is that, capitalists who in an industrialized capitalist society, that's the group who has the greatest amount of power. They also have the greatest wealth and the greatest income, and they tend to have the most prestige, like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, these folks, right? But the idea is that capitalists benefit from the breadwinner homemaker model that was established as sort of the ideal in the United States and in some other places as well, because they benefit from the unpaid labor of those who stay in the home, which has been disproportionately women. Then those who are the unpaid labor in the home, they end up making up what Marx would have referred to as a reserve army of labor. These are people then that can be called up to work by capitalists. If those in the paid labor force get too sort of pushy or wanting too much of a share of their profits, they can replace them with this cheaper pool of labor. It also benefits men. And so again, you can read this in your textbook. a term that I believe is defined in your notes, but that's important to thinking about feminist theory is intersectionality. Um, so I wanted to say just one thing about this. There are the feminist perspective emerged early in sociology when, we can go back to the work of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Some of you may know her from an English class where you read the yellow wallpaper. But basically what these early feminists started arguing is that Archie, I'm sorry, well, these are barking. Sorry. Hey, stop it. Barking at the cat. What they argued was that sorry about that, that women should have full access to all parts of society, that women are more similar to men than different, and they should therefore be equal. They should be able to have equality with men. One of the things that Black feminists in particular pointed out several decades ago now is that the call for women to achieve equality with men in a modern society and industrialized society is problematic for one big reason, and that is all men aren't equal, right? And so because men are unequal due to their race and ethnic identity, social class, sexual orientation, etc. So which men do you want to be equal to? And that also, and this is discussed a bit in that article you read for this week, that the examination of gender roles and gender socialization has been very white-centered. So, not taking into account the unique experiences of women who do not occupy a white body. So intersectionality asks us to think about how the multiple statuses or identities that we hold, gender being one, race and ethnicity being one, social class being one, ability status would be one, age, sexual orientation. We all hold these simultaneously. We're not always thinking about all of them simultaneously. Some are more important to us at different points in our lives. Some people hardly ever think about a particular status that they hold. For example, white people oftentimes don't think about their racial identity, because they oftentimes don't have to. And that's one of the things we would say is associated with privilege. But is to take into account how we experience all these identities at once, and how they can grant us privilege and disadvantage, that we don't all hold, very few people hold identities that across the board grant some privileges, and very few hold identities that across the board are just disadvantaged, and situations can influence how these identities are experienced, and so that's important. Intersectionality allows us to see variance in our experiences. It allows hidden identities to become more visible. It allows us to be more complex in how we look at issues. So one of the things, I think I wrote this to a couple of people that I noted, was that in the discussion post, many people said, I think, families with children are more highly valued in society because it's more normative. True, that might be true on one level. But if we use an intersectional lens, we might think about, well, what about a teen mom? Is that family as highly valued because of that mom's age status? Does that family become devalued in some ways, marginalized in ways? Some privileges of that status and respect that that family might get is somehow compromised. What about, single parent families, so the structure of the family that is headed by women, and in particular? What about families, with lots of children, or a family where maybe not everybody within that family unit has documentation, or to a regularized immigration status. Or how can a family's race identity affect how they are valued? And so I think with intersectional, again, lens helps us do, same-sex families would be another example. But anyways, how the intersectional lens allows us to see more complexity and see how the way which we experience, judge family, something that we all may experience in some way, varies. And when can that grant some privileges to us, and when might grant some disadvantage? And so we always also note that when we talk about privileges that people experience because of the status they hold, doesn't mean they're not working hard, or that they don't have hardship, things like that. But that's another day, another discussion. So I'm just going to skip forward. I really would like to keep this short and end this. I think you can read the rest of this. This complements what's in the book really well. So I guess I'll just point out a couple last things and then be done. It says studying families, what is shared on these slides. There is a little bit of addition to what's in the book, but pretty much complements it. We cannot eliminate bias when it comes to social science research, but we can minimize it. And a key way to do that is to look to see that the methods that were used to collect the data on which knowledge claims are being made, that's a transparent process. So that there is transparency in that research process. How is that research funded? What was the researcher's role? Is it published in a peer-reviewed journal? If it's a journal piece, article, and that's important because when it's peer-reviewed, it's blindly looked at by experts in a relevant field. In the relevant field, they make sure the scientific standards are being upheld, and also, very importantly, ethical standards. This one, different methods, quantitative, qualitative. These are some of the terms that we use. I would say that this PowerPoint is one that, you want to save as we go along in the semester, and we may be looking at some issues where how was the data gathered, and how was the data interpreted? How does that matter to what we know, or what we think we know, or about a family issue? So just a quick example, it says here, when we're looking at hypothesis testing, and then hypothesis is a testable statement, right? So we're looking to see if an independent variable causes change in a dependent variable. Independent variables are sometimes called, indicators or social factors. But for independent variable to cause a change in a dependent variable, it has to have come first. So one question that has been looked at is, and this is not the one that's stated there, is, does single parenthood cause poverty? And when you test that, where single parenthood is the independent variable and poverty is the dependent variable, the evidence appears to show that indeed, yeah, single parents, more poverty. But you also have to take into account what we refer to as we have to take into the time order, and that is thinking about, were those single parents poor before they became pregnant, or were they not poor before they became pregnant? What came first, the poverty or the pregnancy? And as the research was fine-tuned, and researchers started thinking about this a little bit more carefully, we see that most of the time that poverty comes before the single parenthood, right? So then what's maybe the problem? Is it single parenthood or is it poverty, right? So really if we're looking at that in terms of, as being a problem. And then if research is getting more fine-tuned there, like, okay, so what about poverty causes single parenthood? So one of the things that has also been found is that single moms or poor moms, women who became a single mom or pregnant as pregnant when single, who were poor, were also and as teens, excuse me, were also more likely to have not completed high school. So educational level is important as well. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at is the time order when we are thinking about causal. That's how we talk about relationships between independent variables and dependent variables. When we're thinking about causal relationships, causal, one variable causes a change in another. I also have here levels of analysis. That has an actual specific use in social science research methods. So if you have any knowledge or training here, that I don't want to confuse you, but what I'm trying to get at here is different levels at which we can look at a family issue. One of the issues that's been brought up in family research is that today you have more single moms who are seeking college degrees. So they're not waiting to get their college degree to like after their children are raised or to their in high school or something like that. Many have young small children, right? So you can look at that at different levels. So how many like college students at your institution, your college, Wayne State College, are single moms? You could look at how many college students in a state are single moms, in a region of the country, in the nation, right? And we do that. We often sometimes we compare against these different levels, or compare these different levels with one another, because it can tell us, that maybe there's something unique in the social environment of a particular location or a particular social institution. Maybe Wayne State College has more single moms than the university, right? And why would that be? Those are some things that we may look at. And then again, these different methods can help us answer different research questions. We can use existing data, like data you can get from government sources like the Census Bureau, to help us describe populations or test hypotheses. Quantitative research is numerical research. And again, this is explained in your book. And then with qualitative research, that's where we like to explore how individuals experience a social condition, like maybe being a single mom. So I'm pretty sure I'm out of time for what I wanted to do for this video and for what you're probably willing to listen to. We may come back, I will come back at some different points and talk about the importance of longitudinal studies, but you can for now read that in your textbook. I am going to conclude here at the very last slide. Is review questions. I always have this with every PowerPoint, review questions for the chapter. I hope you listened to all this so that you found it a bit helpful. Take good care. Thank you. And I gotta stop.